Hello and welcome to this episode of Hap-pie Baking. This episode dives into a subject that I've received numerous requests from all of you about. I'm going to be sharing 2 indispensable pie recipes from my book, The Book on Pie. First up, my gluten-free dough. That's right, gluten-free. And my dairy-free/vegan dough. What? It's both? Hey! If there's one thing I believe, it's that everyone deserves pie. No matter your intolerances, dietary restrictions, or other preferences, pie is for everyone. The cool thing is, both of these recipes are only slight variants on my favorite pie dough recipe. We'll be using some of the same techniques, but making a few important substitutions. I'm also going to share some troubleshooting tips along the way so that your dough can be as perfect as possible. It's going to be an extremely tolerant episode, so let's get baking. Let's talk about gluten-free pie dough. Gluten-free doughs have a tendency to be mealier or crumblier in texture. It can sometimes be harder to achieve that flakiness. But for that one tricky element working against us, there's also several things working in our favor. Gluten-free doughs are naturally tender, something that can be harder to achieve with wheat-based flours. Here's a few tips when you're working with gluten-free pie dough. There are 2 secret weapons that can help us in achieving the best gluten-free pie dough. The first is an ingredient, and the second is a technique. The ingredient is xanthan gum. Xanthan gum is a super helpful ingredient in lots of gluten-free pastry doughs and batters. It's even included in most gluten-free flour blends. More on that later. Xanthan gum improves the texture of gluten-free baked goods in the following ways. It serves as the binder to a dough, and it helps give structure by helping to hold it together. Xanthan gum also increases elasticity, something that gluten normally provides. Xanthan gum can also help eliminate the aforementioned mealiness and crumbliness. In short, it's key for having a really nice, tender dough. The technique that's going to help us is my extra flaky method. This is the same technique I use in my favorite All Buttah Pie Dough. After mixing and chilling, the dough is rolled out and folded into quarters. This manually helps create layers, which ultimately in the oven helps to create flakiness. In addition to these 2 secret weapons, one of my main pieces of advice when you're making gluten-free dough is to watch the hydration. Be especially careful of overhydration. It can make the dough more than sticky. It can actually make it kind of gluey. I formulated this recipe to be made with a gluten-free flour blend, and nowadays there's a lot of those available at stores. But remember, everyone is slightly different, and they may not all behave the same. I prefer to choose a gluten-free flour blend that does include xanthan gum because I find it's especially helpful for pastry doughs. It should be noted that I add extra xanthan gum to my gluten-free pie dough recipe even when I'm using a flour blend. My preferred blend is Cup for Cup brand. I've got it linked in the video description below. Most flour blends you find in stores aim to emulate all-purpose flour as closely as possible. But they may use different base flours, and that's really important for the hydration. Just like I was saying earlier, if a flour blend has a base of white rice flour, it's going to behave very differently than a flour blend that has a base of tapioca starch. They're going to absorb moisture differently. Just be sure to add water gradually, a little at a time, to help avoid overhydrating your dough. It's also possible to make your own gluten-free flour blend. You'll find versions of these all over the internet, but here's mine. It's right there. Take a screenshot. Oh, it's also in the video description below. Got it? Can move on? Okay, good. Okay, enough tips. Let's get to mixing our dough. Remember, I like to mix my dough by hand, but you can also use tools like a pastry cutter or a food processor. For more info on these, be sure to check out my favorite pie dough video. First, I'm gonna start by cutting the cold butter into about 1/2 inch or 1 centimeter cubes. I do this by cutting the stick of butter in half with my bench knife, rotating the stick, cutting it in half again. So now I've cut it in quarters, and then just going down the stick to cut it into cubes. I'll whisk the dry ingredients together to combine. That's my gluten-free flour blend, the xanthan gum, the extra xanthan gum. Finally, the fine sea salt. Just a quick whisk together to make sure they're completely combined. Next, I'll add the cubed cold butter into the flour. I'm separating each cube as I drop it in. The initial goal is to make sure that each cube is fully coated in the gluten-free flour blend. Once all that butter is added, I'm gonna give it a nice toss until each piece is evenly coated. Cut the butter into the flour by using your fingers and thumbs to flatten each piece into a large shard. As you work, keep tossing the butter with the flour to make sure that each piece is evenly coated. I like to start by doing each piece one time, just squishing each piece, very technical term, squishing the butter into the flour, also known as cutting in or rubbing in as the official method. And after I've done it to each piece once, I'll keep working with it until the largest pieces I see are closer to the size of walnut halves, and the smallest pieces I see are closer in size to peas. There's a great video here on my YouTube channel that talks about all the different ways you can mix butter or any fat into flour to create pie dough. It's really, really interesting if you want to see all the different textures you can achieve. The goal here is to get the pieces of butter as flat as possible. We don't necessarily want rounded pieces or chunks. This is gonna help make a flakier dough later. When all that butter has been worked in properly, it's time to make a well in the center of the mixture. I'm just gonna use my fingers to make kind of a hole right in the middle of the bowl. Then I'll start adding cool water just a little bit at a time. Remember, we can't take any water out, so it's best to just add it gradually so we can watch that hydration closely. The first thing I'm gonna do is toss the mixture. This is gonna help distribute the water evenly, and then I'll work my fingers through trying to break up any of the hydrated clumps just to make sure it's getting as dispersed as possible. I'm gonna add some more water and just repeat that process again. The first thing that will happen is some clumps of dough will start to become hydrated, so I'll break those up just to make sure that I'm not adding too much moisture. It can be easy for some of that hydration to hide in some of those clumps. Once the majority of the dough is starting to clump together, that's when we can use more of a kneading motion or stirring motion to start to bring it more together. When you're making regular pie dough with wheat flours, you can actually be kind of nervous at some points about overworking it because you start to develop gluten. Well, when we're working with gluten-free flours, we don't have that concern. So feel free to knead it as much as is necessary to kind of bring it together. And that kneading is really what will help you to determine if you need to add more moisture or not. Because as you knead the dough, that moisture becomes more and more distributed. The goal is to get the dough to come together without any visible dry floury bits. But we also don't want it to be sticky to the touch. That's a sign that we're bordering on overhydration. The dough should be uniformly combined, but it won't look completely smooth. And it should pass the clean hand test. When a clean, dry hand is pressed onto the surface of the dough, it should come off without any stickiness or floury residue. Now the dough needs to be chilled. I'll form it into a disc about 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters thick, wrap it tightly in plastic wrap or beeswax wrap, and refrigerate it for at least 30 minutes and up to 2 days. Once the dough has chilled for a little while, we can add those folds to help us create some flaky layers. I'm going to dust my work surface lightly with gluten-free flour blend, dust the dough, dust my rolling pin a little bit, and I'm gonna start to roll it out to about 1/2 inch or 1 centimeter thick. The exact shape and size really isn't important here, just the thickness. We just basically wanna get it into a shape so that we can add that fold. As we manipulate the dough to add these folds, the pieces of the fat inside the dough are being shingled out even finer and thinner, and they're being layered. So we've got layers of dough, fat, dough, fat, dough, fat. It's just a little something we can do with our own arms and hands and rolling pins to make this dough that normally wants to stay a little bit on the crumblier side, on the mealier side. We can kind of force it to succumb to our flaky will. Okay, that's looking about right. I'm just gonna brush any excess flour away from the dough and fold it in half. Again, which direction doesn't really matter. We're just gonna fold it in half. Then I'm gonna fold it in half again. Essentially, I'm folding the dough into quarters. I'm gonna do this a second time to create a total of 2 sets of folds. Again, just rolling out the dough to a 1/2 inch thick, 1 centimeter thick. Then I'll fold the dough in half, brush away any excess flour, and fold it in half again. Now at this stage, the dough is sort of square or even maybe rectangular in shape, and it can be helpful when you're making pie dough to start off with a circle when we are ready to roll it. So what I'm going to do is I'm gonna take each end and tuck it under. This starts to create a rounded shape and it almost adds another fold. So we got kind of an approximately round shape. Now I'll just use my hands to form it into more of a round. And I want it to be about 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters thick. I'm gonna wrap the dough tightly in plastic wrap or beeswax wrap and refrigerate it for at least 1 hour before using or up to 2 days.
We interrupt with a quick look at Erin's new pie beans.
There they are. Now let's try our hand at some dairy-free/vegan pie dough. You may know that I am obsessed with my classic All Buttah Pie Dough, but did you know that when I first learned to make pie dough, I was making it dairy-free? Gasp. My grandma originally taught me to make pie dough the way she had learned, which is using shortening. Shortening actually has a huge advantage when it comes to pie dough because it has a higher melting point than butter. This means it's more likely to stay the right texture while you're working with it and while it's baking. This gives one of the flakiest textures of dough ever. A lot of folks think it's easier to work with, and it's definitely easier to achieve those light, flaky layers with shortening over butter. The main con with using shortening over butter is that it doesn't have the same kind of flavor. That's why I normally opt for an all butter crust. But the upside is, since shortening has very little to no flavor, you can just focus on the flavor of the pie itself because you've already achieved a light, tender, and flaky crust. It's a win-win, especially if you're dairy-free or vegan. Shortening doesn't pay off in the same way when it comes to flavor, but it is more foolproof overall, and I think that more than makes up for it. Besides, there are many ways to get big flavor into your pie when it comes to the fillings and toppings. Here are some dairy-free and vegan pie dough tips. The great news about dairy-free and vegan pie dough is we're really only making one main ingredient substitution. We're substituting shortening for the butter in my favorite pie dough recipe. The same concerns exist here as with any pastry dough. You want to keep things cold at all times. This means the ingredients and the dough itself after it's mixed. You want to be careful with hydration. An underhydrated dough can be tough to work with, and an overhydrated dough can bake up tough and cracker-like. In my opinion, the best dairy-free alternative for pie dough is shortening because of that higher melting point. There are other fats that I enjoy using to make pastry doughs. One is lard, and I only mention it because it is dairy-free, but it doesn't hit that vegan mark, so I won't be talking any more about it today. I like to look for non-hydrogenated shortenings. My favorite is the Spectrum brand. In my opinion, avoid shortenings that have butter flavor added. While they are still technically shortening, some of those other additions can actually become sort of problematic when it comes to pastry doughs. And personally, I would rather have a neutral flavored crust than one falsely flavored with butter. And on that note, do not be tempted to use margarine. Don't do it. I kind of hate margarine, guys. Sort of hate it. Really hate it in baking. It behaves completely differently. I am not a fan. There, I said it. Okay, let's mix our dairy-free/vegan dough. Remember, I like to mix by hand, but you can use a pastry cutter or food processor. And again, there's more information about that in my favorite pie dough video. I'll start by cutting my shortening into small pieces. If you're using a stick of shortening, you can still cut it into cubes as I would with butter. But since I'm using shortening from a tub, I took out the weight that I needed and I'm kind of just going to chop it now, kind of into any size piece and I'll just start working with it in the bowl. I've got my all-purpose flour in the bowl, and I'm just gonna add my fine sea salt to it. You can give that a quick whisk, or since my hands are about to get all floury anyway, I'll just mix it with my hands. I'm gonna add my pieces of shortening into the flour, trying to break them up as I add them in. The first goal is going to be to completely coat each piece of shortening with flour. You have to view that flour as almost a protective coating to the fat throughout this mixing process. First, a quick toss to make sure each piece of shortening is well coated and to break up that shortening a little bit more. Then I'm going to start cutting or rubbing the shortening into the flour using my fingers and thumbs. The goal is to flatten each piece into a thin, wide shard, like this. I'll start by doing this to each piece once, and then I'll continue to work the fat into the flour until it reaches the appropriate size. What I'm looking for is that the largest pieces be about the size of walnut halves and the smallest pieces be about the size of peas. Now it's time to start adding water. So I'll make a well in the center of the mixture, just using my fingers to make a hole right in the middle of the bowl. I'll start by adding water gradually, just a little bit at a time. At first, I want to toss the mixture to combine to help distribute that water evenly. The first thing that will happen is that some of the dough will start to become hydrated and form clumps like this. What I want to do is start to break up those clumps a little bit, just because it's easy for water to stay trapped inside. Once I'm starting to see larger clumps of dough forming, I can start more of a stirring motion to really help distribute that moisture. And then finally, a kneading motion to start to bring it together. Keep kneading the dough until all the crumbly bits at the bottom come together to form one dough. The goal here is that the dough shouldn't look totally smooth, but it should hold together as one solid mass. The dough should fully come together, but it's not going to look totally smooth, but it should pass the clean hand test. Pressing a clean, dry hand onto the surface of the dough and lifting it off, you shouldn't have any dry floury bits or any stickiness. I'll form the dough into a disc 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters thick, wrap it tightly in plastic wrap or beeswax wrap, and refrigerate it for at least 30 minutes or up to 2 days. You know me, I love flakiness, so after this dough has chilled, I want to add some folds to it just to up that flakiness quotient in my dairy-free and vegan dough. The dough is nice and chilled. I've got it on a lightly floured work surface. I'll flour the dough and my rolling pin. I'm going to roll it out to a 1/2 inch or 1 centimeter thick. The exact shape and size does not matter here, just the thickness. As we roll out the dough, that shortening inside is going to get shingled even further, and we're going to manipulate it by folding it. Then we'll have more layers of that fat and that dough. Fat dough, fat dough, fat dough. And in the oven, it's gonna bake up to be ultra flaky. It's looking pretty good. I'll just fold it in half, which direction doesn't matter. Brush away any excess flour, and then I'm gonna fold it in half again. Basically, we're folding the dough into quarters. When I do this for my extra flaky method, I usually do this once or twice, and really how much you do is up to you. It depends on how flaky you want your dough. Might as well do it one more time. Let's make it as flaky as possible. Once I've rolled it out, I'll fold it in half, brush away any excess flour, fold it in half again, AKA folding it into quarters. And then I'll end up with this square or rectangle sort of packet, and I want it to be round, so I'll start tucking the ends under itself all the way around. This will make it kind of roughly rounded, and then I'll just use my hands to form it into more of a disc. Again, I want it to be about 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters thick. Wrap this tightly in plastic or beeswax wrap and refrigerate it for at least 1 hour or up to 2 days before using. so much for joining me for this episode of Hap-pie Baking, where I made my gluten-free and vegan/dairy-free pie doughs. As always, the recipes I made in this episode are linked in the video description below, including this black bottom pecan pie and this dairy-free apple pie. If this recipe inspires you to bake a pie, please, please, please let me know in the comments or use hashtag #HappyBaking on social media. I love to see what you're making in your kitchens. If you've got more questions about pie, be sure to let me know in the comments. And until next time, Hap-pie Baking.